Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat, and Outbreak Day 2019 is now over. And that means we have a ton of news and information to dig into. Now, having done both a massive 42-minute breakdown video of the release date trailer, as well as 2 streams in less than 3 days, I simply don't have it in me to do such a long and in-depth video so shortly after. That doesn't mean I won't go in-depth into any of this though. I will in upcoming videos, so don't worry. But that's why this video is titled Recap and not Breakdown. I've watched as many videos and read as many articles as I can about everything that was revealed, and I will try to summarize it in this video, as well as give some brief thoughts about it. I'll divide it into the following sections with timestamps in the description. General/outside the game news, gameplay, and finally, story. So without further ado,
let's get on with it.
As with previous Outbreak days, Naughty Dog revealed new The Last of Us merchandise and goodies for us to buy and download. This year, the focus seemed to be on a collaboration with Dark Horse Comics, as 2 of the more prominent items are made by them. First off, we have this beautiful and awesome looking statue of Ellie in her summer/E3 demo outfit, holding a bow looking very angry. Not much else to say about it other than that I totally would get it if I had the money and it wasn't already sold out. The other Dark Horse item is this art book that'll presumably be like the one for the previous game. Now, I own the Part 1 art book and I gotta say, in comparison, this new one looks absolutely huge. Almost like a novel. Of course, this could just mean that the pages are thicker or of a higher quality, which gives the illusion of it having more content. Or, it could be yet another sign as to how absolutely massive Part 2 is going to be. I mean, if there's just that much art to showcase, I'm definitely gonna try to get my hands on it. Moving on, we have 2 new hats. One with The Last of Us Part 2 written on it, and another with the Firefly logo on it. Not much else to say about them other than that if you're in the market for a new hat and want to show off your love of The Last of Us, these may be an option for you. And if you wanted to complement your hat with a shirt of either Part 2 Ellie or Joel, Naughty Dog has 2 options available for that as well. We also, like during previous Outbreak days, got a new PS4 dynamic theme. From what I gather, it's still free for the time being, so make sure to go and grab it on the PS Store before it becomes a paid item. Finally, for the regular Outbreak Day goodies, we have an Ellie cosplay guide. While I don't think I'll have much use of it, for well, obvious reasons, it does include a few interesting details that I'll cover more in the story section of this video. There was also a new trailer/interview-esque video going behind the scenes of both the gameplay and the story that the journalists got to take part of and play during the Behind Closed Doors media event that was hosted September 24th, posted by Naughty Dog themselves. But I'll go over parts of that in both the gameplay and the story sections of the video, and not here. Finally, for this segment, in stark contrast to everything else we've seen lately, we have some news that are a bit of an emotional roller coaster, to say the least. During the Behind Closed Doors event, Anthony Newman, The Last of Us Part 2's co-game director, told many publications that Factions, The Last of Us's multiplayer mode, will not return in Part 2. An article on Polygon's website quoted him saying, "Multiplayer will not be included in The Last of Us Part 2. I know we had kind of announced that, but as the game developed, it became so ambitious, so grand in scope, and so intricate in its complexity that it really required the full focus of the studio to deliver this single-player experience." While I think we can all appreciate them pushing themselves as hard as they can to make this the best game it can be, I must say that when I first heard of this, I could not believe it. Viewers of my Outbreak Day livestream will recall me brushing it off as nothing more than a bullshit rumor from some irreputable source. But of course, that wasn't the case. While I don't think Naughty Dog owes us anything, or that they have some sort of duty to make a multiplayer mode, this is certainly very disappointing from a community perspective. Sure, there are quite a few people like me who love to dig deep into the lore and continue talking about the world and story for years on end. But the vast majority of people aren't like that. They'll play the story a few times tops and then move on. If there's not something with enough variety to keep them coming back, they won't. That thing, for The Last of Us Part 1, was factions. It's kept the game's community healthy and alive for years after most people stopped caring all that much about the story. But this has me worried that Part 2 won't have much of a community left once the initial months after the game's launch are over. Of course, we'll still have factions left, but I'm not sure that'll be the same once Part 2 drops. Now, of course, that could have been the end of that discussion. But sometime after these news were dropped yesterday, Naughty Dog went out with an official statement. Now, I'll have it here on screen, but I'll only read part of it since most of what it says I've already covered. Quote, "However, you will eventually experience the fruits of our team's online ambition, but not as part of The Last of Us Part 2. When and where it will be realized is still to be determined, but rest assured, we are as big a fan of factions as the rest of our community, and are excited to share more when it's ready." End quote. Now, I don't think they actually planned on saying this in the first place, since obviously whatever work they've done on it is on hold, and they have no idea how they'll realize it or when, but we're sort of forced following the community uproar that followed the announcement that there wouldn't be a Factions 2. However, this video is not the right time for me to discuss this. I'll do so more in another one dedicated to it. But at least know that in some way, sometime, we'll get some sort of updated factions. Now, we got a lot of information about gameplay from this media event. The crux being that unlike E3 2018, when all of it was concentrated to a single gameplay demo and a follow-up panel, it spread out over dozens of articles and videos. Since, while all the journalists got to play the same 2 levels of the game, they all pretty much chose to tell us about different things. So I've, to the best of my ability, compiled all of it here. I'll divide this into smaller sections as well, and it'll be pretty rapid fire as to not make this video super long. Also, I'll have the source of where I got the info in the corner of the screen when I mention it. However, there won't be footage of a lot of these things, since every publication was given the same footage to show, and it's not that long at all. As well as the fact as most of the information we got is from people telling us about what they played and not what we actually saw. I'll start off with the infected and other enemies. Every single enemy will now be more dangerous than in the first game, even the more easier classes such as runners. Exactly how was not elaborated upon, but personally I'd suspect it's a combination of the improved AI systems, Ellie being more fragile, considering how Naughty Dog said that this was supposed to feel like you were surviving within an inch of your abilities, as well as the enemies having access to more tools and moves to attack and damage us. The WLF will use guard/attack dogs, and the way it was announced made it seem like they may be the only faction to use them. These dogs will keep you constantly moving, since they'll be more perceptive than any enemy type we've seen before. Not only can they spot and hear you, but they'll also be able to track your scent. Fortunately for us though, our scent trail will be visible in listen mode, so at least we'll have a chance to strategically keep it away from our canine adversaries. The Shambler is one, emphasis on one, of the new infected classes in Part 2. It'll be tanky and try to rush the player to use its unique ability to release clouds of poisonous corrosive gas. Upon killing these disgusting monsters, they'll explode into a bigger cloud of the very same gas. I wonder where this class would be placed in the progression of infected between runners and bloaters. The already existing infected class, the Stalker, will be expanded upon in Part 2. Neil mentioned this in the behind the scenes video, and talked about how an encounter with just a single one in the Suburbs chapter was considered a mini boss fight, now that the AI systems and close quarters combat being so much more advanced and refined from the first game, which is certainly interesting. If just one of these suckers is considered a mini boss fight, then imagine encountering a dozen of them like in the sewers. Though, I have to mention that it may be considered that, cause this might be the first encounter we have with the class in the game. As we've heard previously, human enemies will be way more threatening than in the previous game. They will be communicating constantly and their AI is greatly improved from the first game. This is also echoed by a lot of the publications that play the game. So it's not just fancy PR speak from Naughty Dog, which is really exciting since the AI in the first game is one of its weaker aspects. Speaking of human enemies, every single one of them now has a name and a relationship to other enemies. Kill a woman and you might hear a man desperately scream her name and curse you for killing his wife. Or kill a dog and see how its handler gets upset and sad to see their friend go. This also supposedly changes the enemy's behavior in combat. Finally, for infected and other enemies, human opponents will now coordinate their search for you after you slip out of sight. They'll rigorously check the tall grass, underneath cars and in other nooks and crannies. And if a loner runs into you, there is a chance they'll run away and shout that they've found you and come back with reinforcements. Now this is certainly cool. Many publications said that playing Part 2 really invoked the feeling of being hunted, and hearing this, as well as seeing some of it, I can totally understand why. Moving on to new details about the combat. In close quarters combat, it will now be possible to execute some sort of combos. What that means is rather unclear, but I'd imagine it's more something like combining punches, slices with Ellie's switchblade and dodges, rather than something out of a fighting game. Also, both the enemies and the player will have the ability to throw each other into objects in the surroundings, which we got an example of in the E3 demo. In combat, we will have access to a lot of different tools and abilities at our disposal that'll allow us to get away and escape from dangerous situations. Exactly what these tools and abilities are was not really elaborated upon, but this is further indication that Part 2 will be a more stealth-focused game than the first one. Whilst going prone might seem like something you do just for stealth, it's still possible to aim, shoot, and use throwables while doing so, though weapon sway will be significantly increased, which is really cool. According to IGN, the control scheme for Part 2 is apparently different enough from Part 1 to be slightly confusing. Now we don't know the exact controls for a lot of things in the game, but we do know that L1 that was previously used for sprinting is now used for the new dodge move. If the controls actually are significantly different from the first game, I'm not too sure how to feel about it, since the ones for Part 1 are practically burned into my mind and reflexes at this point. It'd be nice to be able to play both games and not get confused all the time. Although Listen mode is returning, it'll be different from the first game. No longer will you be able to see all the enemies absolutely clearly within your listening range. This time around, they'll be less clear the further away they are, and their positions as well as what they're doing will be much less accurate and harder to make out, which is something I like. It makes it feel more immersive and less like a straight up wall hack. In Part 1, we had a decent enough variety of cool finishing moves, but after playing for a while, they could get a bit repetitive. This time around, there'll be way more finishing moves, as well as more variety in them. For example, killing an enemy wielding a melee weapon will result in Ellie taking that weapon as they die. Moving on to AI companions. They will apparently now be more capable and play a bigger role in combat. This due to the developers wanting to highlight how everyone in this world needs to be a capable survivor. Now, whilst Ellie certainly wasn't useless in Part 1, it'll be cool to have some Uncharted-style coordinated combat with Dina, Joel, and any other companions we may potentially have during the course of the game. Companions will also supposedly stay out of the line of sight now, unlike in part 1, where hilarious and quite immersion-breaking moments of them just running right in front of enemies whilst you were trying to hide happened all the time. Now, whether or not this means that they are still invisible to enemies remains to be seen. Then we have movement. Ellie will be much more agile and have more fluid and less clunky movement than Joel in part 1, which I'm sure we've all seen and noticed at this point. More interestingly though, is that this time around we'll be able to actually jump. Not like in part 1 where we only actually had to jump like once or twice in the entire story and it arguably looked laughable. Now, not too unlike Uncharted, we'll see more environmental puzzles and verticality, requiring us to jump, as well as more opportunities to get away in combat, for example. As I previously mentioned, there is now a dedicated dodge button. Now, while useful, it certainly won't be a get out of jail free card in a lot of combat situations. It's possible to fail dodging, as well as simply getting overwhelmed when there's more than one trying to kill you. I'm glad that they added it though, cause it's just another one of those things that makes it seem all the more realistic. What's called squeeze-through openings are mostly a new thing in part 2. I mean, we had moments in part 1 where we had to get through tight spaces, but that was exclusively in scripted events and non-combat sequences. In part 2, on the other hand, we'll be able to use our small size to squeeze through tight spaces and lose enemies on our trail in combat, which is another thing that shows us just how much focus there seems to be on stealth and avoided combat in this game. Finally, for movement, we will have access to a rope, which can be used in select areas to get up on or over tall obstacles. Now, we haven't heard all that much about the ladder, container, plank, or pallet puzzles from the previous game, so maybe this is the or one of the replacements for it. Moving on, we have some details on the environment. Part 2's environments will be a lot more open than the first games. Now, exactly how open is hard to tell. I heard that some who played it compare it to The Lost Legacy, but others didn't. What we do know is that the suburbs level, that was the second demo, had several story houses that were largely optional to explore. Some were slightly trickier to get into than others, and a lot of them also had collectibles and side stories to explore. Now, this makes me really glad, because things like this makes the game all the more replayable. And the fact that the surroundings seem jam-packed with lore and side stories is super exciting. In part 1, the only closed-off rooms and areas were the locked shiv doors. In part 2, however, we don't know if the shiv doors return, but one new type of closed-off room was shown in the gameplay, where you had to break a glass window to get in. Interesting. Up next is weapons. The weapon upgrade benches from the first game make a comeback in part 2, but they've gotten a big overhaul. Not only can we now see our guns up close, showcasing the glorious graphics of the game instead of just having a menu with icons, but we also get a more clear picture of what each upgrade actually does, instead of seeing diffuse descriptions like increased damage or increased magazine size. Like we've suspected since the E3 demo, silencers are a new item that can be crafted from the new component called canisters, I believe. As we see them in the demo, they have 3 uses before breaking. It's also unclear whether or not this is only available for the 9mm pistol, or simply pistol as it appears to be called in part 2, but the way many people who play the game refer to it, it does seem like that is the case. Like we saw in the release date trailer, Ellie can use her switchblade in close quarters combat, but it apparently doesn't do a whole lot of damage, though some people who played the game reported that slicing an enemy in between constant dodging was an effective strategy if it was just a one-on-one fight. Finally, for weapons, we have 2 new throwables? Consumables? I'm not sure what to call them, but they are the tripwire mine and the stun mine. By the sound of them, they're most likely traps rather than something you'd throw at an enemy. We know that the Molotov and the smoke bomb is returning, but whether or not the nail bomb will be coming back remains to be seen. Then, finally for this gameplay segment, we have upgrades and crafting. A big difference from the first game is that this time around, we'll get to learn new crafting recipes by upgrading Ellie rather than just have all of them given to us in the first half of the game, which is certainly a very interesting change. Speaking of upgrades, the character upgrading system with the pills is returning in part 2. Only this time around, it's much bigger. This time, there are 4 skill trees of sorts. The first one being survival, which include the following skills: listening mode movement speed, health kit speed, throwing distance, increased health, and 1 additional skill that was locked in the demo. Then crafting, which includes the following skills: the ability to craft melee weapons, upgrading melee weapons, restoring durability, increased damage, crafting speed increase, the ability to upgrade stun bombs to smoke bombs, and increase the amount of smoke bombs crafted for each use of the components. Then stealth, which includes the following skills: the ability to craft silencers, listen mode clarity, silencer durability, and faster stealth kills. And finally, precision, which includes the following skills: reduce weapon sway, move faster whilst aiming, listen mode range, the ability to hold your breath to steady aim, and another locked skill. These skill trees are not like the system in part 1, however. You cannot pick and choose whichever one you like. Rather, you have to learn each skill in order to get access to the next one. Naughty Dog called this, quote-unquote, making your own Ellie, which seems to be indicating that it's made so that you can tailor the game to your preferred playstyle, as well as allowing for replayability. Something else we've previously talked about and suspected is that arrows will be craftable. This, along with the fact how prominent the bow has been in marketing material as well as how important stealth is, makes me think that the bow will probably be the go-to weapon of part 2. Another interesting detail is that it's actually also going to be possible to craft whilst in prone mode. Not much else to say about it other than that I think that's pretty cool. Anyways, that was it for the new gameplay details and information. Now, let's move on to the story stuff. I know many of you are waiting for some in-depth theory videos. They will be coming. I just haven't had a lot of time to sit down and actually think yet. There's just been a constant stream of news for the past few days, and I felt like I wanted to get all of that out of the way first. So in this segment, I won't do that much speculating, but there's still a lot to talk about. Oh, and showing the sources here like in the gameplay segment just got too complicated for me, but the vast majority of it comes from the same ones as I used previously. Anyways, let's begin with the updated themes/synopsis for the game. 2 new summaries of the story have been posted by Naughty Dog themselves on the Part 2 website. The first, simply titled The Last of Us Part 2, and it reads as follows, quote, 5 years after their dangerous journey across the post-pandemic United States, Ellie and Joel have settled down in Jackson, Wyoming. Living amongst a thriving community of survivors has allowed them peace and stability, despite the constant threat of the infected and other, more desperate survivors. When a violent event disrupts that peace, Ellie embarks on a relentless journey to carry out justice and find closure. As she hunts those responsible one by one, she is confronted with the devastating physical and emotional repercussions of her actions. Unquote. Then, the other one is titled A Complex and Emotional Story, which reads, quote, experience the escalating moral conflicts created by Ellie's relentless pursuit of vengeance. The cycle of violence left in her wake will challenge your notions of right versus wrong, good versus evil, and hero versus villain. Unquote. Now, we already knew that Ellie and Joel returned and settled down in Jackson after the events at the hospital in Salt Lake City. And we knew that the game would have the core theme of hatred and revenge, as well as Ellie being launched into this second adventure by a violent act. But one of the more interesting new things here is the quote, cycle of violence, which is a term that has been used in pretty much every article and video released from the media event, which seems to be essentially the concept of how all that happens to and all that Ellie does in part 2 is a spiral or slippery slope that gets progressively worse. Further supported by the fact that this states that as she hunts down whoever wronged her and caused whatever calamity that ruined her peaceful life in Jackson, she's met with devastating consequences. The second description mentions how the cycle of violence will challenge our perception of right and wrong, good and evil, as well as heroes and villains. Now this sounds very much like an extension and continuation of the same moral questions of part 1. How many times have we not debated over whether or not Joel is actually the villain in the end? If the Fireflies truly are the good guys that they are initially made out to be? Or cringed at the extreme violence and gore and maybe even felt bad about having committed it? Many people who played the game echo the feeling that part 2 makes you feel like the monster. And this is most likely due to the improved AI and humanizing of the enemies. Killing somebody's best friend, their spouse or dog, and hearing them cry out in desperation because of it is certainly different than mashing some buttons and seeing a red health bar decrease. Sure, in part 1, enemies curse at you and may shout no when you kill someone, but this is next level stuff. Some people have even reported that enemies may gather around one of their fallen comrades once you've killed them and talk about them. Of course, these guys will kill you the first chance they get as well, but it's not so black and white as most other games where it's just another enemy to get rid of. But that was just the gameplay that invoked all of those feelings and thoughts. Now, imagine how that'll translate to the greater story. I think, at times, we may find ourselves in positions where it'll be hard to side with what Ellie does. And many more moments like the hospital one in part 1, where it's very hard to decide what really is the right thing to do and who is the bad guy. Anyways, let's move on to the chronological summary of the entire story we got in these 2 demos. So, we know that the level called Patrol is from early on in the game before the violent disruption to Ellie's peaceful life, and the one called Suburbs takes place sometime after it later in the game. We don't know exactly how early the first one takes place or how late the second one takes place, nor how far apart they are. But we do know that according to Neil Druckmann, who said that these 2 sections of the game, a total of 2.5 to 3 hours, is apparently only a fraction of The Last of Us Part 2. So let's piece this together as best as we can. One day, sometime during the winter of 2038, presumably around Christmas, 4 years after the end of The Last of Us, there is a party. Dina and Ellie, who have been close friends for those past 4 years, both attend this party. However, this friendship has had an underlying romance for a long time, and when Dina suddenly drags Ellie out to the dance floor for some slow dancing, that romance finally comes up to the surface as they share their first kiss together. The day after that is one where they're both scheduled for a patrol to check the outskirts of Jackson for infected to clear out. As they head out, they in fact do come upon several infected and get themselves into some truly dangerous situations. As the day goes on, the weather gets progressively worse until it eventually turns into a full-on blizzard, and eventually they end up taking cover in the abandoned shelter of one of Tommy's old associates, where they also find his stash of old weed. At this point, with the previous day's events in mind, Dina starts to really poke, and they both end up revealing how much they like each other, after which they kiss for a second time. Now, all of this is confirmed information from either Naughty Dog themselves or from people who play the game. It's not my theory or something I made up. Notice how the part with the cabin and the bloody basement where Ellie was attacked and held down in the release date trailer apparently wasn't a part of this demo. But it still had the blizzard. So does this mean Dina and Ellie get separated and then find each other again? meaning that whatever bad event happens doesn't happen during that day/level? It's hard to tell, but certainly interesting. Now, the second demo, the level called Suburbs, was way more gameplay oriented and thus didn't have as much story, but I'll try to piece it together anyways. Sometime later, after the calamity that disrupted Ellie's normal life in Jackson, she finds herself in a suburban area close to Seattle which is crawling with members of the WLF, that are the main faction controlling the city who kill outsiders on sight. Ellie hears on a radio, as well as in rumblings from the nearby soldiers, that there's apparently another trespasser on WLF territory, a male, and that they are pursuing and closing in on him. Many journalists mention that Ellie is there to find a friend. Whether or not this male trespasser is that friend or not is unclear. As she makes her way through the suburb, she also encounters the odd shambler here and there. After a while, she sees an explosion. Supposedly, according to IGN at least, she hopes that it's Tommy, as she is actually in fact there to see him. She then makes her way through a number of WLF positions to investigate, and eventually she's grabbed from behind by none other than Joel, as WLF Humvees roll past in the background. Now, this one was a bit harder to get details on. A lot of people didn't talk about the story of this level, since it was so gameplay focused. But if it is in fact true that she's there to see Tommy, I certainly think that's very interesting. It would mean that he'd have more than a minor role in Jackson at the start of the game, and I really like the sound of that. I also wonder if this is the first time we actually have Joel as a companion. Because if this is late in the game, where has he been up to that point? Anyways, as I said, this is not a video for theories, so let's move on. Alright, so let's talk a bit about the WLF, the newest faction to be revealed for part 2. This is the faction I called Unknown Heavily Armed Militia faction in my breakdown of the release date trailer, which you should totally watch if you haven't. We don't know all that much about them. In fact, I'm not even sure we know their official name, aside from the abbreviated version of it, of course. A lot of the journalists and publications call them different things. I've heard Washington Liberation Force, Western Liberation Front, Washington Liberation Front, and the Western Liberation Force. All very similar, of course, but I'm not sure which one is correct. What we do know about them is that they are hostile to anyone that isn't from the Seattle area, and will do everything in their power to get rid of them. That they are a heavily armed militia with access to military vehicles like the Humvee we saw at the end of the release date trailer, and that they make use of guard dogs. There is one screenshot, though, that gives us a tiny bit more of an insight into who they are as a faction. And it's this one. We see a large banner hanging over an old truck that says WLF and then rules must be followed by 4 rules. The first one stating that all WLF soldiers' instructions must be followed. The second one, and arguably the most interesting one, says Fedra collaborators will be executed. And the third one, permission required to leave assigned zone. And the final one, curfew will remain in effect until further notice. Now, whatever their name actually is, we can be pretty sure Liberation is part of it. That, along with the fact that these guys don't seem to be on the best of terms with Fedra, tells me that the Liberation, in their name, likely refers to the liberation from the military dictatorship of Fedra. Now, whether this is an ongoing goal of theirs, or if they've wiped out any military presence in the region, is unclear. But considering how Naughty Dog constantly brings up how massive this game is in scope, I would find it odd if the Seraphites and the WLF are the only 2 factions we find in the game. So it's certainly possible that we'll find Fedra sometime in an active conflict with these guys. Also, these guys probably formed similarly to the way both the Hunters and the Fireflies did, through some sort of uprising against the military, which explains their disdain for them as well as their access to military gear and vehicles. Also, judging by these rules, it seems like the people of Seattle just traded one military dictatorship for another. Finally, even though we have very little proof and information about this, I still think, as I said in my breakdown video, that these guys are at war with the Seraphites. It makes perfect sense considering what we know about them. As well as one final detail that one person who was at the media event mentioned. Now I think it may have been Grizz Gaming, sorry if I pronounced that wrong by the way, but I'm not sure. The adversaries of the WLF call them wolves. Now, what other faction do we know to call their enemies wolves? The Seraphites. Moving on, I want to talk a bit about Joel and Ellie. Now, there was hardly anything revealed about the two, which of course is understandable. But we got a few tiny pieces of information from some of the people who played the demos. So Ellie and Joel's relationship is strained by the time of part 2. Now, this was hardly something that any of us didn't expect. Some of it is said to be cause of, well, regular teenage to parent stuff, but other things due to past events. Now, that obviously refers to the end of the first game. During the first level, Patrol, there is supposedly some conversation between Dina and Ellie about Joel. Not much, but Dina is said to have asked Ellie about how things are between her and Joel, which indicates that they may not be at their best. Joel and Ellie also apparently watch movies together, another thing she and Dina apparently talked about. And Joel's favorites are old 80s action flicks, which I find pretty funny. But I'm afraid that's it as far as the Ellie and Joel stuff goes. Finally, to end this very long video, I just wanted to bring up some quick details that I didn't really see fitting anywhere else. So, in my breakdown video, I wondered what the actual purpose of the Jackson patrols were, considering their small size. And it turns out, it's to look for infected to clear out. Pretty obvious, but I thought I should mention it anyways. Also, the Jackson section takes place 4 years, not 5, after the first game. It's easy to miss, but Hallie Gross actually mentions this in the behind the scenes video. Neil Druckmann is also said to have stated in interviews during the media event that Ellie and Dina's relationship is very much integral to The Last of Us Part 2's core. Which is why it would be very surprising and kind of contradictory if she were to be killed off immediately. And finally, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the Ellie cosplay guide gives us some interesting details and lays some theories to rest. Firstly, there is a section on the Hamsa bracelet Ellie can be seen wearing. Now, many people have assumed that this is proof of Dina's death, something that Ellie keeps around as a memory of her fallen friend and love interest. But in this guide, it's clearly stated that, quote, Ellie wears a bracelet, a gift from Dina, on her right wrist. Also, secondly, regarding a theory / just general confusion that's been going on way longer than the bracelet, is the one about Ellie's bite mark. Now, ever since the first trailer in 2016, people have wondered why we can't or can barely see it. Is it gone? Is it healed? In all of the shots we've gotten so far, it's been next to impossible to see. But here, in this cosplay guide, we get high-resolution pictures of her arm up close. And as it turns out, the bite is still very much there, just extremely well concealed. So, that's a wrap on my second really long video this week. I didn't intend for it to be quite this long again, but there was just so much to talk about. If you're waiting for more in-depth theory videos, don't worry, those are coming. But for now, I want to know what you guys think. Despite my best efforts to get everything into this video, I'm sure I've missed tons anyways. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments down below, and why not continue the conversation on my Discord server after that? You'll find the link to that in the description down below. And until next time, have a great day.